Mr. President.
The senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. And I appreciate the comments from my colleague from Indiana that I got to hear a moment ago. I think he's absolutely right. We have deeper and more important problems that we need to address, along with the important decision we make over the next 24 hours on the debt limit. It's necessary to extend the debt limit, but it's not sufficient. We also have to deal with these underlying fiscal problems. And to my colleague from Indiana, I think you stated that well. I rise today, Madam President, to talk about the debt limit proposal and to talk about how we can provide a pathway forward on a bipartisan basis, again, not just to solve this immediate problem that confronts us, but also to deal with these deeper and very serious problems we have with our fiscal deficits and a weak economy. Maybe good to start by asking why we're here. We're here because we have a law that says that the U.S. government can only borrow so much. And the law says that the U.S. government can only borrow up to $14.3 trillion. It's a lot of money. $14.3 trillion is almost the size of our entire economy now. It's probably 95% of our economy. This is unprecedented, of course. We've never had debts of this level before. Many economists look at this and believe that it's already having a very negative impact on our economy to have this huge debt out there because it affects the private sector. But we have come to this $14.3 trillion limit, and now in order for government to continue to provide everyday government services, benefits to our troops, veterans, Social Security, and so on, the limit needs to be raised. We now borrow at the federal government level more than 40 cents of every dollar that's spent. So it seems to me only common sense that when you've maxed out on your credit card, which is what the federal government has done, and when you have this deep underlying problem of these huge deficits, $1.5 trillion this year, record level also, and mounting debt, that you should deal with the underlying problem before you extend the credit card limit. And so that's why we're here. And I think it's an appropriate debate. I wish it could have been resolved sooner. I think that it can be resolved over the next day or so. But I think it's an important discussion that we have to have. The President has made it clear that he'd like the debt limit increased, and he would like it increased high enough to last through the 2012 election. Interesting, because Election Day is not part of the economic calendar. It's not the end of a fiscal year. It's not the end of a calendar year. It's the political calendar. And it's unfortunate that during this time of such budgetary uncertainty, we seem focused on political deadlines. Meeting this request the President has made that it be extended until beyond the election would be the largest debt increase that's ever been approved by the United States Congress. It would be over $2 trillion. So, again, I think it's appropriate we have this discussion before we agree to the largest debt limit increase in the history of our country. We've never raised the debt limit that much at one time before. The President also says that we need to do this because the markets want certainty that a long-term debt limit increase will happen. I think there is something to that in the sense of market certainty. If there could be a longer debt limit increase, I suppose it would add to market certainty. But markets don't just want a solution to this debt limit issue. In fact, I would argue that what they want even more is a solution to the soaring debt itself. And this is not based on conjecture. It's based on looking at what those who are analyzing our economy say. Fitch, Moody's, Standard & Poor's. You've heard about these credit agencies. A lot of people are talking about them. They're the ones threatening to downgrade our debt. What they say is, yes, we should extend the debt limit, but they say that's just the first step. We have to also deal with the underlying fiscal problems in our country, or the downgrade will occur. They want a serious commitment to reining in the spending spree that's buried us in debt in the first place. So it has to be dealt with. A friend of mine sent me an email tonight, Keith Hennessy, which was kind of interesting way to put it for people who follow the financial markets. He said, we face both a liquidity crisis right now, which is the federal government can't borrow to meet its needs. But we also face a solvency crisis, which is the federal government deficits and the accumulation of those deficits into the debt is at historic levels and already harming the economy and threatening to harm the economy in very significant ways. So we need to deal with both. One way to show this commitment to the solvency problem, to the debt problem, is to be sure that we guarantee $1 in spending cuts for every dollar we raise the debt limit. This is a formula that was laid out several months ago by Speaker Boehner, and I think it's been widely agreed to. You'll see it in the proposal that Majority Leader Reid has proposed. As we'll talk about in a minute, unfortunately, some of the budget savings that he thought were there based on the Congressional Budget Office analysis are not real cuts. But that was the formula that he used. The President has also talked about this formula, and I think it's widely agreed that we need to be sure we're only extending the debt limit to the extent that we are reducing spending. So if it's going to be over $2 trillion of debt limit extension, we need to find $2 trillion in spending reductions over time. It's interesting, as I've analyzed how this formula would work over time, that it actually makes sense for our economy, because if we raise the debt limit $1 but also cut $1 in spending, it not only helps us short term, but over a 10-year period, as I look at this, what the Congressional Budget Office tells us in terms of what the debt is likely to be, just about at the 10th year, we would actually balance the federal budget. Not get rid of the debt. The debt will continue to grow all during that time period, unfortunately. But there would actually be, at the end of that process, an annual balanced budget by applying that formula. I don't think that necessarily was the intent when the formula was derived, but it is interesting that it's a formula that makes sense to get us at least over 10 years to the point where we're not spending more than we're taking in. Given that the President, Majority Leader, would like to see a debt increase of over $2 trillion, and Republicans and even many Democrats, again, want to be sure that there is an equal-sized spending cut, it seems to me there's an obvious way forward. We can raise the debt limit for this extended period of time, but we have to require equal spending cuts, and they have to be real. If they aren't meaningful and credible spending cuts, then we'll have the same negative economic consequence we've been talking about tonight. The credit agencies will downgrade our debt. We will have higher interest rates, which affect every American family. Student loans, credit card loans, certainly our mortgages. It affects small businesses who are trying to hire people to be able to get credit. If you have a car loan, it's going to affect you. It affects the entire economy. So we've got to deal with this issue in a real way, in a way that is credible and meaningful. Unfortunately, the proposal that Majority Leader Reid has put forward, although again it was intended to meet this formula we talked about of $1 spending cuts for every $1 of increase, has some spending cuts that do not meet that standard of being credible and meaningful. The biggest one is about $1 trillion in what's called the Global War on Terrorism spending reduction. A little background on this. When you're writing a budget baseline, the Congressional Budget Office says you have to assume all the spending that's happening now, so-called discretionary spending, will continue into the future. So for the next years, they assume for the next 10 years that we will spend about $150 billion a year on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nobody believes or hopes that will happen. It has not been requested by the President. No one intends to spend that money. In fact, the President's own budget assumes that instead of the $1.7 trillion that would be over the next decade, that instead we will spend about $600 billion. That's what the President's budget says. That's what people assume. This means that Senator Reid's proposal to take credit for cutting an additional $1.1 trillion that's not going to be spent anyway is not going to be viewed as a credible proposal. Why? Because it's money that's not planning to be spent. It's a little like a family saying, let's assume we're going to take a vacation we're never going to take, and it's going to cost $10,000, and then saying, we saved $10,000 on our budget. I wish it weren't so. I wish the $1.1 trillion was credible spending reductions we could rely on. But the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, many other observers have looked at this and said, frankly, it's not a meaningful reduction in spending. So there are some meaningful reductions in spending in the proposal of the majority leader, but this particular one, unfortunately, is a big part of what he has proposed. Out of his $2.7 trillion, about $1.1 is his proposal on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. You might hear it referred to on the floor here as the OCO spending, Overseas Contingency Operations. So I think that's one thing we should do as a Congress, is be sure these cuts are meaningful and credible, and we can do that. Second, let's expand this initial round of spending cuts. Right now, when you take out the war spending we just talked about that's not going to actually materialize, the savings won't materialize, and when you look at the Congressional Budget Office score of the majority leader's proposal, the cuts are just under $1 trillion. Still a substantial and I think a credible proposal of just under $1 trillion. But that's all that's guaranteed. However, Washington is scheduled to spend about $46 trillion over that same period, the next decade. Think about that, $46 trillion. Increased spending, by the way, by about 57% during that time period. So I think we can do a lot better than just cutting $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And I think we can do it in a bipartisan fashion. I say that because I've identified $2.8 trillion in spending reductions that have been agreed to by some bipartisan process. The Biden talks, the Gang of Six, the President's Fiscal Commission, some of the President's own discussions. The Vice President's group specifically came up with some spending reductions in addition to this $1 trillion. So my hope is that we can take some of these spending cuts that have been agreed to through some bipartisan process and apply them to this initial package. Finally, Majority Leader Reid and Speaker Boehner's proposals both have this deficit reduction committee. It's an approach which I think makes sense to be sure that we get at the longer range problem here, which is our unsustainable, very important but unsustainable entitlement programs, tax reform, which will help stimulate more economic growth, budget reform, which is clearly needed. I've been here 6 months. We've done nothing on a budget here, but in fact, the Senate hasn't done a budget in 2 years. It sounds like we're in need of some reforms to make this place work. So this committee, I think, makes sense. The Majority Leader calls for the committee to reduce the budget deficit to 3% of GDP. I think it's an interesting proposal. I think we need to be sure we know how long it would take to reach that level and how long we should maintain it, because there's no time frame in his proposal. So 3% of GDP, does that mean we would wait until a certain time period, say, if it's a 10-year proposal, the 9th year or the 10th year, and suddenly make those reductions? If so, the reductions would not be nearly as significant. Instead, what we should do is put a time frame in place, 5 years or 10 years, I'd prefer 5, and to say that there will be reductions starting in the first fiscal year to meet the 3% target. If you don't do that, then over that period of time, 5 years or 10 years, we will not see the kinds of reductions in spending that I think Majority Leader Reid would like to see. And I know that many of us here on this side of the aisle believe is necessary. Eventually, we've got to balance the budget, as we talked about earlier. And it needs to be something within this 3% committee that leads us to that. Also, under the Majority Leader's bill, there's no requirement to actually enact any of the Deficit Reduction Committee's reforms. I think he has a very interesting proposal in terms of having an expedited process on the floor, an up or down vote, no amendments. I think that's smart. But if the Deficit Reduction Committee deadlocks, or if the Deficit Reduction Committee fails to get the votes here on the floor of the Senate, there needs to be some sort of a mechanism, a fail-safe mechanism, or a so-called trigger for accomplishing dollar-for-dollar cuts. The House plan, I think, responsibly makes much of this debt limit increase contingent on the cuts being actually approved and signed into law in this committee. If the President and Majority Leader Reid want the entire debt limit increase now, we would need some sort of guarantee that this deficit reduction will actually take place. A common sense compromise, it seems to me, would be to add sequestration language, meaning you sequester across the board all spending, if the Deficit Reduction Committee doesn't work, deadlocks, or doesn't pass on the floor, even under these expedited procedures. And I would say that you could limit that sequestration to the size of the debt limit increase. Not even the size that Speaker Boehner has, which was $1.8 trillion, or Leader Reid, I think, assumes, which is even higher than that for his debt reduction committee. But just to be sure that it meets, again, this formula of $1 spending cuts for every dollar of extension for the debt limit to the period that the President would like to see. That seems to me to be the kind of proposal that, at this late hour, could be agreed to, and certainly should be. Sequestration, by the way, is not a new concept. It's enforced nearly every budget reform law of the past 20 years in the United States Congress. It can guarantee that one way or another we will receive the deficit reduction equal to the debt limit increase, which is, again, the intent by Majority Leader Reid, Speaker Boehner, and others. Finally, I think we need to allow the Senate to vote on a balanced budget amendment. Let's have a vote. Leader Reid's talked about that. Speaker Boehner has talked about that. I think it's important to provide the representatives of the American people the opportunity to have an up or down vote on a balanced budget, or many forms of a balanced budget, because there are different iterations of a balanced budget. It seems that this path forward should be able to satisfy both sides. The President, Majority Leader, would get the larger debt limit increase they want. There would be guaranteed deficit reduction that's necessary to begin fixing the budget and to assuring financial markets that we're up to the task. So I think, Madam Chair, when you look at the various options that we've got before us, there is a way forward here. It's a way forward that says, let's ensure that we really have this upfront spending. Let's remove the global war on savings gimmick, because it doesn't work. Let's strengthen the initial savings, provide guarantees that this deficit reduction committee will actually work, and then let's have a vote on the balanced budget amendment. Madam President, finally, I've heard the President talk about the importance of having the debt limit increase because of the market uncertainty in the economy. I agree that we need to do everything we can to stimulate this economy right now. We had bad news this week.
The senator's time has expired.
Unanimous consent for 30 additional seconds.
Without objection.
However, again, getting back to our earlier discussion, if we simply extend the debt limit and don't deal with the underlying issue of our fiscal problems, what we called earlier the solvency crisis, we will have these same negative economic consequences. With low growth in this quarter and unfortunately high unemployment, over 9%, we need to do everything we can to encourage pro-growth economic policies here. That includes tax reform, as we talked about. It includes using the energy resources we have in this country. It includes regulatory relief. And yes, it includes dealing with our debt and deficit.